This session is going to be a little different than the sessions before in a couple different ways. First, we're going to introduce ourselves instead of being introduced by the other person. It's because we know ourselves really well. Second, we're going to speak a kind of slightly different. I'm going to speak for about 18 minutes, 20 minutes, and then Carrie's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to ask each other a single question and then open it up to you so we can get maximum participation in. I did want to mention a couple things before I get started. I am Manuel Pastor. I am a professor of sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. I used to be at UC Santa Cruz, and I run a few research centers there. I've written books, etc. Of course, when I'm introducing myself, the really important thing is that I've been married for 33 years. Yes. As my wife and I say, many of them happily. And so I've got the endurance to get through the next 18 minutes with you. Now, there's no way in the world, for two reasons, that I'm going to be able to speak as rapidly as that Glazer. Number one, because nobody in the world can speak as rapidly as that Glazer. And the second, and I always like to say it before I get started, is that I have a speech disorder called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. It's what Diane Rehm on NPR has. Bobby Kennedy Jr. has it. Now I have it. Must be contagious. And I always like to assure people, while I'm talking, my voice might break or out, but it also, please know that it gets treated once a month with Botox, because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So it seems to. So I want to talk a little bit about rights to the city and fights for the city, thinking a little bit about who has the right to the city, but also where are the kind of movements for social justice in the city. In order to do that, it's important to think about the backdrop of demographic change that's occurring in the United States. It's now predicted by the year 2042, 2043, that the United States will be a so-called majority-minority country. That is, it'll be majority people of color. 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce, I didn't say the majority of entrants into the workforce, the majority of the workforce will be people of color supporting an older retired generation. Probably well before the end of this decade, the majority of those under the age of 18 will be people of color. And a lot of that demographic change is occurring in America's metropolitan areas. Often when we say America's cities, we're thinking just the city, but it's really the metropolitan area that counts. So that's big demographic change, but of course we've seen it before. If you look at the demographic change between the year 2000 and the year 2040 in the United States, moving from about 69% non-Hispanic white to about 50% non-Hispanic white, that is exactly the demographic change that occurred in California between 1980 and 2000. California is America fast forward. The demographic change that occurred here, with all of the bumpiness around immigration struggles, around city fights in the cities, are struggles that are going to be happening through the rest of the country as well. Of course, California will not be standing still as it moves forward, but there's an important thing about the demographic change in California to keep in mind, and then a second thing about it nationally. The first thing is that demographic change in California is actually slowing. You know, if you sort of straight lined from the past, you would have predicted by the year 2040 or so that California would be 100% Latino. That is, everyone would have to say California the right way. Palo Alto would have to be said with much more emphasis. Of course, Stanford would always be Stanford. But as you can see, the demographic change in California is actually slowing down. In fact, the only large metropolitan area in the United States in the last 10 years that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children, Los Angeles. Because it's a more settled population, age structure is such that people are having children at a later age as well. And what's driving this change then in the United States as a whole is no longer immigration, but children. We'll get to that in a minute. But this is what the United States looked like in 1980. This is the counties of the United States with the darker shades being greater than 50% people of color. This is what the country looked like by the way, look at California. Only one county was majority minority, Imperial County on the border with Mexico. Los Angeles had not crossed that threshold. By the year 2010, California changed dramatically, but by the year 2040, the rest of the country is changing dramatically as well. So you're going to note the big demographic. I was talking to somebody today about Seattle, and they're going, isn't it all white? I'm like, have you not been there recently? But you might think about demographic change like Salt Lake City, which is slated to become majority people of color by 2035. Now, I don't know what you think. When I think about Salt Lake City, I think not just white, but super white, right? Like Mormons are shiny, right? But really what's going on there is that that's an image of the past. America's metropolitan areas are going through rapid demographic change, and the places that are not going through rapid demographic change are facing severe economic problems, lack economic vitality. What's driving that change now is no longer immigration. Immigration into the country has actually dramatically slowed down, not just in recent years, but it looks like there's a long-term trend to it slowing down, particularly because of lower fertility rates in Mexico. In the last 3 years, net migration from Mexico has been zero. There's as many Mexicans returning to Mexico as coming into the United States, and that's a sea change from where we were before. But if you look at this, what's really driving that now and in the future is children. The number of young whites in the United States in the last 10 years actually fell by 4.3 million. Now, I always like to reassure audiences that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. We would have noticed that. It would have been reported on Fox News. And probably blamed on Obamacare. What it does mean is that more are moving into 19 and 20 than moving into 1 and 2. So if you look at the next America, 4.8 million 800,000 new Asian Pacific Islanders. And one of the fascinating things about this demographic diversity, and Carrie will talk a little bit about it, but I wanted to include some slides from Seattle just for her, is that this diversity now is occurring not where people think. There's a notion, again, that the diversity is all going to occur in California. It's now occurring in the rest of the country. There's thought that the diversity must be occurring in our cities, but in fact, where the diversity is occurring is in America's suburbs. If you look at Seattle, the places that have become more people of color are actually the southern suburbs of Seattle, and the city itself is actually whitening slightly as a result of processes of gentrification and some displacement. The interesting thing about this is that America's suburbs, which by the way now hold more than half of the country's poor, lack the civic infrastructure for dealing with these issues. They lack the social services infrastructure. They lack the community organizing infrastructure that's frequently essential for low-income groups, diverse groups, to make sure that their issues get on the agenda. So a rapidly changing geography of our diversity, and another really important part of our diversity looking forward has to do with the age structure of our population. The non-Hispanic white population in the United States, the median age, half older, half younger, is 42. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders is 35. The median age for African Americans, 32. The median age for Native Americans, about 30. The median age for Latinos, 27. 42, 27, 15 years, it's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. One is it helps to explain our demographic change. Because when you're 27, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 42, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be Godspeed, right? The second thing it helps to explain is our nation's politics. Because we have an older generation looking at a younger generation with a high level of racial disconnect about who that younger generation is. And it plays out in our politics. The state in the United States that's got the largest generation gap, the whitest old and the brownest young, is Arizona. A place with fractious politics around immigration, ethnic studies in schools, and more importantly, the third largest cuts in K-12 per capita spending last 5 years, and the largest cuts in public university spending in the last 5 years. So reconnecting generations and geographies is an important part of the work of thinking about America's cities and metropolitan areas. And it's particularly important because of the rising concern and issues around inequality. Now, I always like to ask this question: how many of you have heard of this book? How many of you read this book? Okay, very good. I actually read it too. But you should know that this is the most unread book that Amazon records because, they can see how far you went in your Kindle, and everybody stops about 35 pages in and goes, shit, it's French, right? So, but it's a good book, and I recommend it. One of the things, like many books, is a lot of things have gotten attached to it that aren't necessarily in the book. But the idea is that it's really brought up a lot of our key questions around income inequality and mobility. It's clear that we've become now more unequal in terms of the share going to the top 1% or 1 to 5% or 5 to 10% than at any point in our history for the top 1%, with the exception of the period right before the Great Depression. When people see that inequality, they think, well, at least we still have mobility over time. We may be very unequal, but the sort of myth of the United States is that we're mobile over time. This charts a measure of income inequality against a measure called intergenerational earning elasticity, which virtually no one understands. So I call it instead class stickiness. That is, the probability if you start in the lower quintile, you'll stay in the lower quintile. Start in the upper quintile, you'll stay in the upper quintile. There's only two advanced capitalist countries that are less mobile than the United States. One is the United Kingdom, and they have a queen. And the second is Italy. And they've got Silvio Berlusconi, which is kind of like having a queen, right? So we've got a tremendous level of inequality, a tremendous level of immobility, and we've got racial disparities. The history of them is the only period they really began to close was in the period, this is the ratio of black to white income and a ratio of white to Latino income. The only time they really began to close was during the civil rights movement and during the latter years of the Clinton administration. So facing these issues, people are paying attention not only to the demography that's going to be moving through the next America, but to the unequal situation that they find themselves in and are inheriting. And one crucial thing about that to realize is that there's been a sea change going on within the economics field. And the sea change within the economics field is to begin to question whether or not this level of inequality is actually good for economic growth. Now, I want to be very clear, particularly because of some stuff Ed Glazer was saying earlier, with which I would agree. There is certainly a situation in which you've got so much equality that you've smothered all incentives, you've smothered all possibility for savings and people moving forward. But there's also a possibility of having so much inequality that you're actually corroding economic growth because you're reducing the incentives for working people, because you're creating problems of underinvestment in public education, you're creating problems of political capacity to make decisions. And so we've been looking at this issue at both America's metropolitan areas, and others have been looking at this at a country level. Interesting study that just came out 2 years ago from the International Monetary Fund, a well-known left-leaning organization. They looked at what led to sustained growth for countries over time. And they found that the single largest predictor of the shortening of a growth spell was the initial level of income inequality, with the argument on their side being that that led to underinvestment in public education, insecure property rights, and political conflict. The Cleveland Federal Reserve, looking at metropolitan regions in the United States, looked and asked what predicts economic growth in these metropolitan regions. They found things mattered that you would think: an anchor university, a diversified industrial structure, a skilled populace. But they also found, to their surprise, that three things mattered dramatically for mid-sized regions, much the size of Cleveland: the initial level of income inequality, the level of racial segregation, and the gaps between city and suburb in terms of poverty experience. We've been finding this too in our work. This is looking at the length. We mimic the IMF study for America's metropolitan regions, and the three largest predictors of a shortened growth spell were initial level of income inequality, residential segregation, and metropolitan fragmentation, having too many governments essentially per metropolitan area, kind of impeding the ability to collaborate. And for those of you who are nerds like me, it's a hazard ratio regression. This is multivariate, and all the variables are set in time before, so we're not picking up reverse causality. And we also, in another study, did a two-stage least squares simultaneous equations model, which basically for the rest of you means I'm right. So So we've been developing these ideas further in both popular work with PolicyLink and then also in this book, which I must say I probably should let you know so you could be selling it in the front. It's called Just Growth. Just because it's not up front doesn't mean there's no reason for you to not buy it. You can buy it on Kindle and make it the most second unread volume in Kindle, which I feel fine about. And it's also about to be made into a major motion picture in which I'm going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas, so I'm really quite excited about this. So what do I think all of this means, both this change in demography and also this question of dealing with the tremendous income inequality, which manifests itself in our cities, but there's also this metro areas, I should say, but there's also this useful opportunity of understanding that that's corrosive for growth. And it's becoming more and more realized at a metropolitan level. And the reason is that at the metro level, people come face to face, race to race, place to place with some of the consequences of that. The way in which it can make a city unsafe, as Ed was talking about with New York, the way in which it can challenge the prosperity of a region moving forward. Our view of people with whom we're working, there's sort of three things that need to happen. One is to build equity into our economic strategies. The second is to create data and dialogue so people have a mechanism for dealing with and talking about these issues. And the third is to understand the role of social movements in making things like this happen. So let me just tell you a story very quickly about a particular place, San Antonio, Texas. Just 2 years ago, the voters of San Antonio did something remarkable. They passed a sales tax on themselves in Texas to pay for pre-K initially targeted at disadvantaged kids. That's a pretty remarkable thing to happen, but what's more remarkable about it is that it was something that was supported by the mayor, by community-based organizations, and by the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce that saw it as a workforce development issue for San Antonio rolling 20 years forward. And if you go to San Antonio now, everybody talks about how all those sectors collaborate together, and in their collaboration, they've been able to get a promise zone, a promise neighborhood, promise zone designation, a choice neighborhood, all of the Sustainable Communities Initiative, all celebrated because they're such collaborators. But if you went to San Antonio 30 years ago, what you would have found is the west side of San Antonio, largely Latino, frozen out of politics and political representation in the city, and you would have found several years of community organizers, the Industrial Areas Foundation, doing dramatic protests to raise their issues, to put them on the forefront, to become part of the coalition that helped Henry Cisneros govern, and then to eventually persuade the business community to come in their direction. And the reason I say this is that when people think about the collaborative city, they think about collaboration as kind of happy-faced, like that ride in Disneyland, It's a Small World, where all the children are singing. A collaborative city can be filled with conflict as well, in which people are raising difficult issues, challenging one another to be able to come together. However, in doing that, it's important to make sure that people have a platform, often a shared platform of data that allows them to understand where the region is heading. In the San Antonio case, they put together something called San Antonio 90, which is what they used in the 80s to chart where they're going forward. Right now, they have something called SA 2020, which is trying to put together the data platform for understanding what they're doing. We've just done a data platform with PolicyLink out of Oakland called the National Equity Atlas. It's at nationalequityatlas.org. I urge you to take a look at it and think about data for the metropolitan region. But we're going to hear in a little while about the data platform that Seattle's put in to try to get people to understand these issues and then to be able to measure progress moving forward. It's also important to realize that where this change is happening, to pay attention to the demography, to pay attention to these issues of inequality, is in our metropolitan areas. Consider mayors like Antonio Villaraigosa and now Bill de Blasio raising all sorts of issues for their cities and their metro areas. And one of the reasons why is because these are places where people can sense their fortunes being intertwined and their destinies being interwoven. And part of doing that is trying now to think about the kinds of movements that need to be in place to make cities healthy. The movements that have been raising the minimum wage, not at a federal level, but at city levels and also at state levels. The movements that have been creating community benefits agreements, sure that large developments actually yield benefits to low-income communities. The movements that on a local level just helped California pass Prop 47, which is going to move people out of prisons and begin to address the over-incarceration crisis. The local metropolitan movements that have created the opportunity for immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, to live safely without the threat of deportation in America's metropolitan areas. America's metropolitan areas are a hotbed of innovation, but they're a hotbed of movements for inclusion as well, and that has to be an important part of how we think about the city moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Carrie Cihak, and I'm the Chief of Policy for King County Executive Dow Constantine. I'm really delighted to be here. Manuel and I have had several other conversations before, and I can assure the center that the goal for getting academic research up and out into communities is really taking place, because I've learned a lot. So when I say I'm Chief of Policy for King County, I thought it would be helpful to give you a little context about what that means. So first of all, and especially for those of you from New York, this is Washington State. It's over up in the, that corner of the country, not Washington, D.C. And in red there is King County. King County is the 14th largest county in the country. We are made up of 2 million people. The biggest city in King County is Seattle. See King County blown out there with Seattle in the center. But the county includes 38 other cities and suburban cities and a large rural area with farms and forest land. We have spectacular mountains and waterfront, and I encourage you all to come. County government, we've got about 12,000 employees, a $6 billion endeavor, and we really focus on a lot of systems, bus systems, public health systems, court systems, wastewater systems, you name it. All right, so what does it mean that I'm a policy chief? Well, I don't have a badge. I really wish I did. But I do have a team of subject matter experts who are policy advisors to the executive. You can think of us as like the interdisciplinary studies center of county government. And we cover economic development, land use, transportation, law, justice, environmental sustainability, health and human services. Our job is to really take the long view and steer the county towards policies and practices that are going to make our county a great place to live 20 years from now. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about megatrends, and what I'm going to do for you today is kind of pull forward a lot of the themes that you've heard from other people throughout the day. You heard some of them from Manuel just now, and what I'm really delighted about is I get to go back to my boss and tell him that all of our work has been validated by a lot of fancy Ivy League professors. So before I get into the megatrends, I just want to give you two framing comments. First of all, from my perch at a regional county government, the theme of this conference, the city, I think not about Seattle, but that bigger metro region that I described. And that, in fact, extends beyond King County itself to the whole Puget Sound corridor. And more than ever, I think our cities, suburbs, exurbs are all linked together into these big metro regional markets, and they require regional thinking and perspective to solve the problems that we face, and you'll hear that woven throughout my comments. And secondly, while I'm naturally going to focus on talking to you about King County, I think you'll see that a lot of these trends are applied to many other metro regions around the country, and in fact around the globe. So the first big megatrend that's impacting almost all metro regions around the country is population growth, and I'm talking about rapid population growth. So King County has grown from about 1.2 million people in 1990 to over 2 million today, and over the next 15 years, the region is going to add another 1 million people. That's pretty rapid population growth. The city of Seattle itself is the fastest growing city in the United States right now. We've managed our growth smartly thus far. Part of that is due to smart policies. Hello. We've got strong growth management. Part of it's also due to historical accident. Our modern region is not a very old one, and we're pretty constrained, I think, happily, by mountains and water. The speed of the growth that's taking place now is creating more challenges like those you see here in the Bay Area. Our infrastructure is not only not growing, it is failing. And when I talk about infrastructure, I don't just mean transportation. I also mean things like education, public health, and all of those great things that we rely on. The fabric of our city is changing, and some people find that really exciting. Some people find it really challenging, and all in all, it's very personal for people. Second big megatrend that's taking place in King County and other urban areas are huge demographic shifts of the type that you heard Manuel discuss. As a whole, King County is becoming rapidly very diverse. All of the growth in our population over the last 20 years has been people of color, all of it. And there you can see from 1980, the red part of the pie being people who are white or non-Hispanic, and then moving over to 2010, the really rapid change. In addition, over half of our population under 18 right now is non-white. The demographic shifts are not evenly distributed, which lead to a lot of paradoxes in our region in terms of our identity. So even though Seattle is the fastest growing city in the US, the growth in the region over this time period has predominantly occurred in the suburban cities of Seattle. Overall, the county grew 66% from 1990 to 2010. The growth in Seattle proper was 18%. Paradoxically as well, I think you heard Manuel mention, Seattle is in fact the 5th whitest city in the United States, and yet at the same time, our suburban cities are incredibly diverse. The city of the school district in Tukwila, a small city south of Seattle, is the most diverse school district in the entire United States. Another paradox, half of our population is half of the growth in population is comprised of people who are foreign-born, and over 20% of the county is foreign-born. And what's happening is we have lots of major international corporations, Microsoft, Boeing, Amazon, all those names you know, attracting highly paid talent from all around the world. And at the same time, we're home to large refugee populations from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So it's a very diverse and interesting place to be. Third megatrend is growing inequality. On the face of it, we are doing really fantastic in King County, outperforming all y'all. So we have a really high quality of life, good health, high life expectancy, we're highly educated, we have lower unemployment, we have stronger household income. But by every one of these metrics, there are stark inequities by race, income, and the zip code in which you live in King County. And I'm just going to show you a few graphs very quickly. And what I want you to pay attention to on the right-hand side there, the green dots are the metric above the median. The kind of dark purple dots are below the median. And you're going to see that for every one of these metrics, there are big differences and big differences by place, and you're going to see a pattern emerge. So there's income by race and place. There's unemployment by race and place. There's graduation rates by race and place. There's adult obesity by race and place. There's adults insured by race and place. There's life expectancy by race and place. There's more than a 10-year difference between the life expectancy of someone living on Mercer Island, a bedroom community, and someone living in South King County. So race and place matter in King County. The northern part of the county doing quite well, the southern part of the county really struggling, and that corresponds with where a lot of people of color live. Manuel told you why we should care about that. We care about that because when all of us are better off, all of us are better off. These three trends converge into suburbanization of poverty. The demographic and population changes with the growing inequality has led to a rapid suburbanization of poverty in King County. 25 years ago, the majority of poor people lived in Seattle. Today, there are far more poor people living in the suburbs than in Seattle. And as Manuel mentioned, it's the funding and the institutional mechanisms that we've set up at the federal level that have not kept up with the trend. And our suburban regions are highly inequipped to deal with this poverty. I can recommend to you an excellent book, Confronting Suburban Poverty in America, by Alan Berube and Elizabeth Kneebone. at the Brookings Institution for more. And they use King County as a case study in this. The fourth big megatrend, which I'm not really going to spend any time on, but can't go without mention, is climate change. It's already impacting us now. I heard Eric talk earlier about how Sandy Hook was a real awakening for people on the East Coast. We're already seeing changes in our region. Puget Sound rising 8 inches, droughts in the summer, floods in the winter, snowpack down, greater intensity of forest fires, and bigger forest fires. And those impacts are going to get worse. Fifth megatrend, the Metropolitan Revolution, AKA don't wait for the federales to come and save you, because they won't. This is a tag taken from a book by Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley at the Brookings Institution. The federal and the state governments have become increasingly unreliable partners for us at the regional level. And if we are going to successfully address the megatrends that are facing metro areas, we are the ones who are going to have to innovate, fund, and create the solutions. And if we can let metros do that and prosper, then so will everyone else. And that's going to require finding uncommon common ground, a phrase I'll borrow from Manuel, finding these broad coalitions of government, communities, business, labor, and nonprofits. We're doing that in King County. We have a very aggressive equity and social justice body of work that we infuse throughout all the work that we do. It's depicted in part by this lovely tree. The roots are what we call our determinants of equity, the things that everyone needs to prosper and thrive. And what we are doing in King County is making sure that all of our county government agencies align themselves to these determinants of equity and figure out what they can do at a very practical level to increase access to these determinants. So a great example of that in practice is over on the left-hand side there, access to health and human services. One area where we have had some success at the federal level is around Obamacare. And one of the things that we have done is align every county agency, our court system, our jail, our solid waste system, around getting information out to people about how they can enroll. And we have been fantastically successful. In fact, I can let you know that the number up there of 100,000 people enrolled has doubled since we printed this to 200,000 people. We also have a big initiative right now, probably our top initiative, to look at early childhood development and really focus on the 0 to 3, find our own local funding to try to make sure that we are supporting families and very young children to make the social and emotional connections that we know lead to great developing brains and great outcomes later in life. Just some more examples. And then likewise on climate change, we have a pretty aggressive strategy. And this is where a lot of those coalitions as well really come into play, trying to find that uncommon common ground with cities, communities, businesses to address the impacts of climate change. And I'm going to leave it there and hope that we can have some more conversation about our work.